March 2nd, 1943. The morning sun broke over the Bismarck Sea with deceptive tranquility, casting golden light across 16 Japanese vessels cutting through the Pacific waters. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of destroyer Shikinami, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the convoy stretching before him like a serpent. 8 transport ships, laden with 6,900 troops of the Imperial Japanese Army's 5th to 1st Division, plowed steadily toward Lae, New Guinea. 8 destroyers formed a protective screen around them, their crews alert but confident. They had made this run before. They would make it again, but 50 seconds, that was all the warning these captains would receive before hell descended from the sky. The convoy had departed Rabaul on the 1st of March, sailing under orders that brooked no delay. General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army, needed reinforcements desperately. The Allied advance through New Guinea threatened to sever Japan's entire South Pacific defense line. These troops, these supplies, these ships, they represented the lifeline of empire. In the Southwest Theater, Captain Shigeru Sugama, commanding the transport Kyokusei Maru, understood this with every fiber of his being. Below his decks, soldiers packed like sardines awaited their destiny, many writing final letters to families they sensed they might never see again. The weather had been Japan's ally initially. Heavy cloud cover blanketed the convoy as it moved south through St. George's Channel, providing natural concealment from American and Australian reconnaissance aircraft. Admiral Kimura allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. Intelligence suggested the Allies had spotted them, but perhaps, just perhaps, the weather would hold long enough to reach Lae's protective coastal waters. That hope died at 1400 hours on March 2nd. Lieutenant Woodbury W. Wood, piloting a Royal Australian Air Force Beta for Liberator, broke through the clouds at 80,000 feet and spotted the convoy approximately 100 miles west of Cape Gloucester. His radio crackled to life immediately. Contact, contact, contact. Large enemy convoy, course 150, speed 7 knots. According to official U.S. Army Air Force's historical records maintained at Maxwell Air Force Base, this sighting triggered the largest Allied air operation in the Southwest Pacific Theater to date. On the Japanese flagship, the radio officer burst onto the bridge. Admiral, American reconnaissance aircraft overhead. Kimura's jaw tightened. The Americans knew. That meant their bombers would come. The question was when, and it was strength. He ordered the convoy to maintain course and speed. Turning back now would be more dangerous than pressing forward. They were committed. What Admiral Kimura did not know, what he could not know, was that 500 miles away at Port Moresby, 5th Air Force Commander General George Kenney was already orchestrating the convoy's destruction. Kenney had been waiting for this opportunity, refining a radical new tactical approach that would revolutionize low-level naval warfare. His weapon was not the traditional high-altitude bombing that allowed ships to maneuver and evade. His weapon was something the Japanese Navy had never encountered: masthead-height skip bombing, delivered by modified B-25 Mitchell bombers. Captain Katsumi Shibuya, commanding destroyer Arashio, maintained his station on the convoy's port flank as the sun descended toward the horizon. Tomorrow would bring the test. He knew. Tomorrow the Americans would come. He had no idea that tomorrow, Japanese captains would have exactly 50 seconds between the moment they spotted incoming aircraft and the instant bombs skipped across the water into their hulls. 50 seconds to save their ships. 50 seconds to save their men. 50 seconds before the Bismarck Sea ran red. The tactical innovation that would seal the convoy's fate had been born from frustration and battlefield necessity months earlier. Major Paul Irving Gunn, a former Navy pilot who had joined the Army Air Forces after escaping from the Philippines, watched with growing anger as conventional high-altitude bombing attacks consistently failed to hit maneuvering Japanese ships. The physics were simple, but devastating. By the time bombs fell from 10,000 feet, ship captains had 30 to 40 seconds to execute evasive maneuvers. Japanese vessels, nimble and well-commanded, regularly escaped destruction despite wave after wave of bombing runs. Gunn refused to accept this tactical stalemate. Working closely with General Kenney at the 5th Air Force headquarters in Brisbane, he developed a revolutionary approach inspired by the British Royal Air Force's anti-shipping strikes. Instead of bombing from altitude, why not attack at masthead height so low that bombs would skip across the water like stones on a pond before slamming into hulls? The delayed fuse ordnance would then penetrate deep into the ship before detonating, maximizing internal damage. The concept required radical modifications to B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. Engineering teams stripped out the lower gun turrets and installed 850 caliber machine guns in the nose, transforming the aircraft into flying gunships capable of suppressing deck-mounted anti-aircraft batteries during the attack run. Additional forward-firing guns were mounted in fixed positions along the fuselage. The result was a bomber carrying more forward firepower than many fighter aircraft, able to rake enemy decks with devastating effect while approaching at wave-top height. Lieutenant Colonel Ed Larner commanded the 3rd Attack Group, the unit tasked with perfecting this dangerous new technique. His pilots practiced relentlessly over the Coral Sea, skimming 15 feet above the waves at 220 miles per hour, releasing 1,000-pound bombs with 5-second delayed fuses. The margin for error was non-existent. To high, and the bomb would die beneath the water without skipping. To low, and the bomber itself might cartwheel into the sea. The release point had to be precisely 100 yards from the target, close enough that the bomb would skip like a flat stone, but far enough to avoid the explosion. By early March 1943, Larner's pilots could consistently achieve hits from this suicidal range. They had transformed themselves into something unprecedented in aerial warfare. Bomber crews willing to fly directly into point-blank anti-aircraft fire to deliver a killing blow. Reconnaissance reports from the Australian War Memorial Archives indicate that when Admiral Camora's convoy was spotted on March 2nd, General Kenny immediately ordered the 3rd Attack Group to prepare for what he codenamed Operation Bismarck. While Japanese sailors slept fitfully that night aboard their rolling transports, mechanics at Port Moresby's airfields worked through darkness loading bombs and ammunition. Armor Sergeant Jake Morrison, whose account appears in official Air Force historical collections, recalled the tension. "We knew this was it. We trained for months. Now we were gonna find out if skip bombing really worked, or if we just invented a new way to get our boys killed." Captain Sugama walked the decks of Kyokusei Maru in the pre-dawn hours of March 3rd, checking that the soldiers below remained calm. Many were seasick from the rolling seas. Others prayed quietly at makeshift Shinto shrines. None knew the 13 B-17 flying fortresses were already airborne from Port Moresby, climbing through the darkness toward them. This initial strike wave was the Hammer traditional high-altitude bombers, whose mission was not necessarily to sink ships, but to force the convoy into formation, breaking evasive maneuvers. Behind the B-17s, a second wave prepared to launch, 13 and 20 attack bombers armed with fragmentation bombs, their mission to suppress anti-aircraft positions, and behind them, the killing stroke, 12 B-25 Mitchell skip bombers from the 3rd Attack Group, piloted by men who had trained to fly so low they could count rivets on enemy hulls. As the sun rose over the Bismarck Sea on March 3rd, radar operators aboard destroyer Shikinami detected the first contacts. Admiral Kamura immediately ordered combat stations throughout the convoy. Gun crews raced to their positions. Ship captains gripped their engine telegraphs, ready to maneuver. The standard Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine called for violent turns and speed changes the moment enemy bombers reached their release points overhead. But the Americans weren't attacking from overhead anymore. They were attacking from the horizon. And when those B-25s appeared, Japanese captains would have 50 seconds the time it took the bombers to close from initial visual contact to bomb release at 100 yards to comprehend the new reality, recognize the threat, and execute evasive action. 50 seconds that would prove exactly 49 seconds to few. The B-17s appeared at 0900 hours on March 3, 1943, materializing through broken clouds at 14,000 feet like angels of death. Captain Sugama watched them approach Kyokusei Maru with the fatalistic calm of a man who had survived too many air raids to panic. His anti-aircraft crews opened fire immediately, sending streams of 25mm shells skyward. Black puffs of flak dotted the pristine morning sky as the flying fortresses began their bombing runs. Lieutenant Woodrow more piloted the lead B-17 through the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. His bombardier, hunched over the Norden bomb site, tracked the largest transport below. Steady, steady. The bomb bay doors yawned open. At 14,000 feet, the release point was everything to early or to late, and the bombs would splash harmlessly into the sea. Bombs away, 500-pound high-explosive bombs tumbled downward, their fins stabilizing them into graceful, deadly arcs. Admiral Kamura watched the bombs fall and barked orders to his flagship's helmsman, Omokaji Ipai. Hard to port, the destroyer heeled violently as her engines churned water into foam. Throughout the convoy, Eve Wright captain executed similar maneuvers, their ships weaving and turning in coordinated chaos. The B-17 bombs, released from such altitude, took nearly 30 seconds to fall, an eternity for skilled ship handlers. Most bombs exploded in towering columns of white water, their deadly payloads wasted on empty ocean. One struck transport Teomaru amidships, but the single hit failed to slow the rugged cargo vessel. Another exploded close aboard Nojima, shaking the transport violently but causing only superficial damage. The high-altitude attack, while spectacular and terrifying, proved largely ineffective. Japanese doctrine was working. The convoy remained essentially intact, steam and smoke pouring from every stack as the ships maintained their southward push toward Leh. What the Japanese commanders did not realize was that this first strike had been a set up the jab before the knockout punch. According to declassified U.S. 5th Air Force operational reports, housed at the National Archives, General Kinney had specifically designed the mission sequence to disrupt the convoy's formation and distract attention skyward, away from the wave-top approaches the skip bombers would exploit. The A-20 attack bombers arrived at 0-9-30 hours, screaming in at 3,000 feet. These twin-engine aircraft carried no heavy bombs. Instead, their bays were stuffed with 23-pound parachute fragmentation bombs designed to saturate destroyer decks and silence anti-aircraft positions. Lieutenant James Murphy led the first flight directly toward destroyer Asagumo, his bombardier releasing a stream of small bombs that blossomed across the warship's stern like deadly flowers. Japanese sailors manning the open 25mm mounts had no protection from the fragmentation patterns that swept their decks. Men fell in clusters, shredded by white-hot shrapnel. Fire control directors were knocked offline. The carefully coordinated anti-aircraft defense began to falter as gun crews dove for cover or fell wounded beside their weapons. Aboard Kyokusei Maru, Captain Sugama watched in horror as the destroyer screened his protection against air attack lost its coordinated defensive fire. Then, at 0950 hours, sailors on the convoy's port side began pointing toward the horizon. Low against the water, impossibly low, a formation of aircraft approached in perfect line abreast formation. These were not high-altitude bombers that could be dodged. These were not fragmentation attackers that could be endured. These were B-25 Mitchells configured for skip bombing, and they were coming in at masthead height with their nose guns already blazing. Captain Katsumi Shibuya, commanding destroyer Arashio, spotted them first. His report was terse, urgent, low-level bombers, bearing to 70, extreme low altitude. He spun toward his helmsman, prepared to execute the emergency turn that doctrine demanded. But something about these aircraft seemed wrong. They were suicidally low, impossibly low. Waves broke over their wings as they held formation barely 20 feet above the sea surface. The lead Mitchell, piloted by Captain Clinton True, opened fire at 800 yards. 850 caliber machine guns in the nose erupted simultaneously, their combined rate of fire exceeding 3,000 rounds per minute. Tracers arced across the narrowing gap between aircraft and ship, smashing into Arashio's superstructure. Gun crews that had survived the fragmentation attack now faced this overwhelming barrage. Men fell away from their weapons. Others froze, paralyzed by the sight of a bomber attacking like a fighter, coming directly at them with guns hammering. Shibuya had his 50 seconds. The moment he spotted the Mitchell formation to the instant True released his skip bomb would be approximately 50 seconds at the bomber's approach speed. But three factors conspired against him: the shock of the unprecedented attack profile, the suppressive fire sweeping his decks, and the simple human reaction time required to process this new threat. He waited 5 seconds too long to turn. True released his 1,000-pound bomb at exactly 95 yards. The ordnance struck the water, skipped once like a stone, and slammed into Arashio's hull just above the waterline amidships. The delayed fuse gave True's Mitchell time to roar overhead before the bomb detonated deep inside the destroyer's engine room. The explosion was catastrophic, unmuffled, one followed by a gust of steam and smoke erupting from hatches and ventilators. Arashio staggered as if struck by a giant fist, her engines dying, her momentum bleeding away. Behind True, 11 more B-25s pressed their attacks with mechanical precision. Japanese captains, now fully aware of the threat, threw their ships into violent turns. But the 50-second window had closed. The skip bombers were already at release point, their bombs skipping across the water like flat stones thrown by giants. Transport Kyokusei Maru took the second skip bomb directly beneath her forward cargo hold. Captain Sugama felt the deck lurch beneath his feet as the delayed fuse bomb penetrated deep into the ship's bowels before detonating. The explosion ripped through 3 decks, igniting aviation fuel stored for the fighters and reconnaissance aircraft the ship carried. Secondary explosions followed in rapid succession, a chain reaction of destruction that transformed the transport into a floating inferno within seconds. Soldiers of the 51st Division, packed in the holds below, had no chance. The blast collapsed bulkheads, sealing escape routes. Fire raced through passageways, consuming oxygen. Those who survived the initial explosion found themselves trapped in rapidly flooding compartments, their screams lost amid the roar of flames and rushing water. Sugama ordered abandoned ship even as the bridge began listing beneath him. Men poured onto the canning decks, many already burning, others jumping into the sea before life jackets could be distributed. Lieutenant Colonel Ed Larner, leading the second flight of skip bombers, watched Kyokusei Maru transform into a pillar of smoke and selected his next target. Transport Teiyo Maru, the cargo ship's captain, Commander Hideaki Tanaka, had learned from watching Kyokusei Maru's death. When Larner's Mitchell appeared at wave-top height, Tanaka was already executing a hard turn to starboard, presenting the narrowest possible profile. His anti-aircraft crews, those still alive after the fragmentation attack, fired desperately at the approaching bomber. 50 caliber rounds stitched across Teiyo Maru's superstructure. Tanaka ignored them, focusing entirely on his turn. The Mitchell's bomb release came at 100 yards. Larner's bombardier had timed it perfectly, but Tanaka's maneuver caused the skip bomb to strike the ship's stern at an angle. The ordnance glanced off the armored plating protecting the rudder assembly and skipped again, exploding harmlessly 50 yards beyond the transport. But Tanaka's victory was momentary. The third Mitchell in Larner's flight, piloted by Captain Richard Ellis, adjusted his approach angle and released at 80 yards closer than doctrine recommended, but compensating for the target's turn. This bomb struck Teiyo Maru squarely amidships on the waterline. The explosion opened a 20-foot gash in the hull plates, flooding the engine room instantly. The transport lost all power, dead in the water, settling by the stern as seawater poured through the wound. Admiral Kimura, aboard destroyer Shikinami, witnessed the systematic destruction of his convoy with mounting horror. In less than 15 minutes, 3 transports were sinking or dead in the water. 2 destroyers were heavily damaged, and the surviving ships were scattered across miles of ocean, their defensive formation shattered. Historical accounts compiled by the Australian War Memorial indicate that Kimura's radio messages during this phase of the battle reflected growing desperation under heavy air attack. Formation broken. Severe casualties. Require immediate air support. No air support came. Japanese fighters based at Rabaul, over 100 miles distant, had launched too late. By the time Zero fighters arrived over the Bismarck Sea, the skip bombing attack would be over. The convoy would be on its own, fighting for survival against an enemy that had discovered how to kill ships with devastating efficiency. Transport Io Maru became the 4th victim. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Nakamura, had watched the skip bombing technique with cold calculation. When the B-25s approached his ship, he ordered full speed ahead and maintained course, gambling that the bombers would overcompensate for expected evasive maneuvers. His gambit nearly succeeded. The first to skip bombs passed ahead of Io Maru's bow, their pilots having led the target too much. But Captain William Ben, flying the 3rd aircraft in that attack wave, recognized Nakamura's strategy. Ben held his approach, tracking Io Maru's steady course, and released at precisely the moment Nakamura believed the danger had passed. The 1,000-pound bomb skipped once and struck the transport's port side near the waterline, penetrating into the forward hold where ammunition for the 51st Division's artillery units was stored. The detonation of the skip bomb's 5-second delay fuse triggered a cataclysmic secondary explosion as artillery shells and small arms ammunition cooked off in a sustained fireball. Io Maru quite literally disintegrated, her forward section separating from the stern. In a cloud of vaporized metal and steam, the transport's back broke, both halves tilting upward like a closing book, spilling soldiers and cargo into the sea. She sank in less than 3 minutes, taking over 800 men with her. Destroyer Tokitsuka's, attempting to shield the remaining transports, took a skip bomb amidships that destroyed her forward boiler room. The warship slowed, but remained afloat, limping in circles as her damage control teams fought flooding. Her sister destroyer Yukikaze, one of the Luke Kaya's ships in the Imperial Japanese Navy, executed a perfect evasive turn and somehow escaped undamaged, despite being bracketed by 3 skip bombs. Years later, Yukikaze's captain would attribute their survival to divine intervention and the skill of his helmsman, who had anticipated the bomb releases with uncanny precision. By 10:30 hours on March 3, 1943, The first skip bombing attack was complete. 5 transports were sinking or dead in the water. 3 destroyers were damaged to critically. The convoy, the T had departed Rabaul with such confidence, was now a scattered collection of burning hulks and desperate survivors. But General Kenny's assault was not finished. According to declassified operational records, he had planned for multiple strike waves throughout the day. The Japanese would be given no respite, no opportunity to regroup. Admiral Kimura made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered the destroyers to abandon rescue operations and proceed to lay at maximum speed. The thousands of men struggling in the oil-slicked waters would have to fend for themselves. The surviving transports that could still make way were to continue toward lay independently. The convoy, as an organized military formation, had ceased to exist. Each ship now fought for its own survival. The 52nd warning the Japanese captains had theoretically possessed had proven utterly inadequate against skip bombing, human reaction time, the unprecedented attack profile, and the devastating suppressive fire from the B-25's nose guns had rendered traditional evasive tactics nearly useless. The Imperial Japanese Navy had just received a brutal lesson. American innovation had changed the rules of aerial warfare over water. The afternoon of March 3, 1943, brought no mercy to the shattered Japanese convoy as the surviving transports limped southward, trailing oil slicks and debris. Reconnaissance aircraft from Port Moresby tracked their every movement. General Kenny studied the reports in his operations room and ordered the second major strike wave to launch at 1300 hours. This assault would be even larger than the morning attack. 28 B-25s configured for skip bombing, along with 12 A-20 attack bombers for suppression and 12 P-38 Lightning fighters for protection against the Japanese fighters that had finally arrived from Rabaul. Transport Ogawa Maru, which had somehow survived the morning attack with minor damage, now found herself alone on the open ocean. Her captain, Commander Yoshio Nakagawa, had obeyed Admiral Kimura's orders to proceed independently toward Leh. His ship carried nearly 900 dread soldiers of the 51st Division, packed so tightly below decks that many stood pressed against one another in the dim compartments. Nakagawa had pushed his engines to maximum speed, hoping to reach the relative safety of Leh's harbor before nightfall. At 1400 hours, lookouts spotted the distinctive twin tails of B-25 Mitchells approaching from the southeast. Nakagawa ordered combat stations and began the serpentine evasive maneuvers that represented his only defense. But Ogawa Maru was a cargo vessel, not a warship. She could not turn quickly or accelerate rapidly. Her anti-aircraft armament consisted of a handful of machine guns manned by Army personnel with minimal gunnery training. Major Ralph Chelly led the skip bomber flight that selected Ogawa Maru as their target. Chelly had participated in the morning attacks and understood exactly how effective the technique could be. He approached the transport at 15 feet above the waves, his 8 nose-mounted 50 caliber guns already firing, walking streams of tracers across the ship's superstructure. The suppressive fire was devastating. Machine gun crews on Ogawa Maru's decks fell away from their weapons, cut down before they could bring effective fire to bear on the attacking bomber. Nakagawa had his 50 seconds. From the moment Chelly's Mitchell appeared on the horizon to the instant the skip bomb released, time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Nakagawa's hands moved the engine telegraph to full ahead. He ordered hard to starboard. The transport began her ponderous turn. But merchant ships do not pivot like destroyers. Ogawa Maru's momentum carried her forward even as her rudder bit into the water. Chelly released at 90 yards. The 1,000-pound bomb struck the water, skipped cleanly, and slammed into Ogawa Maru's hull just forward of the engine room. The delayed fuse explosion deep within. The ship ruptured fuel tanks and buckled structural members. Fire erupted throughout the engineering spaces. The transport lost power immediately, wallowing dead in the water as flames spread through her lower decks. Below, in the packed troop compartments, panic replaced order. Smoke filled the passages. Emergency lighting failed. Men clawed toward ladders and hatches, driven by primal survival instinct. But the companionways designed for orderly boarding could not accommodate 900 desperate soldiers simultaneously. Bottlenecks formed. Men trampled their comrades. The ship began listing to starboard, adding the terror of imminent capsizing to the chaos of fire and flooding. Captain Nakagawa remained on the bridge as his ship died beneath him, issuing orders that no one could obey, watching soldiers pour over the rails into the sea. Historical records indicate that Ogawa Maru remained afloat for approximately 40 minutes before rolling onto her beam ends. and sinking stern first. Fewer than 200 of her 900 passengers and crew survived. Transport Nojima, which had taken minor damage in the morning attack, met her end at 1500 hours. Her captain, Commander Takeo Miura, had learned from observing the morning strikes. When B-25s appeared, he immediately ordered full speed and began a radical zigzag pattern, changing course every 30 seconds. This aggressive maneuvering made his ship a difficult target. The first to skip bombers attacking Nojima both missed, their bombs skipping past her stern. But the third pilot, Lieutenant James Murray, anticipated Miura's pattern. Murray waited through the course changes, identified the timing interval, and timed his approach to coincide with Nojima's turn back to port. His bomb release came precisely as the transport completed her maneuver and steadied on her new course the brief moment when she moved in a straight line. The skip bomb struck the waterline on Nojima's port quarter and detonated in her after hold. The explosion severed Nojima's stern section, which broke away and sank immediately. The forward two-thirds of the transport remained afloat, flooding rapidly, but still containing hundreds of trapped soldiers. Miura ordered abandoned ship, but with the stern gone, many of the ship's lifeboats and life rafts had been lost. Men jumped from the tilting bow section, some without life jackets, swimming desperately away from the suction they knew would come when the wreck finally went under. Destroyer Asashio, attempting to rescue survivors from the morning's attacks, became the final major casualty of March 3rd. Commander Masao Tachibana had pulled nearly 300 survivors from the water. When lookouts spotted approaching B-25s, Tachibana faced an impossible choice: continue rescue operations and become a stationary target, or abandon the swimmers and attempt to defend his ship. According to Japanese naval records preserved in the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, Tachibana chose to maneuver, ordering his destroyer to emergency full speed and executing evasive turns. But Asashio had lingered too long. The skip bombers caught her before she could build up sufficient speed for effective evasion. Captain Edward Scott Mitchell placed a bomb into the destroyer's forward magazine. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, a massive fireball that consumed the entire forward section of the warship. Asashio's bow section simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the detonation of her own ordnance. The after section remained afloat for several minutes, her stern rising vertically from the water before sliding beneath the waves. By nightfall on March 3rd, 1943, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was effectively over. Of 16 Japanese ships that had departed Rabaul 2 days earlier, only 4 destroyers survived to reach Lae, and all for board damage. Every transport was sunk or sinking. According to U.S. 5th Air Force after-action reports, 12,000 tons of shipping had been sent to the bottom. More critically, fewer than 1,200 of the 6,900 troops aboard the transport survived. Equipment losses included an entire division's artillery, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies. The 52nd warning that Japanese doctrine had counted upon had proven worthless against skip bombing's point-blank attack profile. The Imperial Japanese Navy had learned a terrible lesson about American tactical innovation and the ruthless efficiency with which new technologies could be employed. But the lesson had come too late to save Admiral Komura's convoy. The waters of the Bismarck Sea would remember March 3rd, 1943, as the day when 50 seconds became a death sentence. Dawn on March 4th, 1943, revealed a seascape transformed into a graveyard. Oil slicks stretched for miles across the Bismarck Sea, staining the water black. Debris fields marked where ships had gone down. Life jackets, wooden crates, personal effects, and bodies floated amid the wreckage. Thousands of Japanese soldiers clung to rafts, driftwood, or simply treaded water, their strength fading with each passing hour. Many had been in the water since the previous morning, over 24 hours of exposure to sun, salt, and sharks. Major Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and later served as a staff officer analyzing Pacific naval operations, would write in his post-war memoir that the Bismarck Sea defeat represented a tactical disaster of the first magnitude, demonstrating that American ingenuity in developing new attack methods had outpaced our defensive doctrines. This assessment, while accurate, came with the clarity of hindsight. In the immediate aftermath, Japanese commanders struggled to comprehend the scale of their defeat. General Kenny was not finished. Intelligence reports indicated that hundreds, possibly thousands of Japanese soldiers remained alive in the water, some drifting on life rafts toward the New Guinea coast. Kenny made a controversial decision. He ordered fighter bombers to strafe the survivors. This order, which would later generate significant ethical debate, was justified by Kenny's staff as military necessity. Any Japanese soldier who reached shore could rejoin enemy forces. The survivors represented a defeated but potentially recoverable military asset. Throughout March 4th, P-38 Lightning fighters and a 20 attack bombers swept across the Bismarck Sea, machine gunning life rafts and swimming survivors. Australian Bristol Beaufighter aircraft from No. 30 Squadron, RAAF, also participated in these operations. The strafing attacks were methodical and devastating. Life rafts disintegrated under concentrated fire. Swimmers simply disappeared beneath bullet-churned water. Oil slicks ignited from tracer rounds, creating patches of burning sea that trapped men in circles of flame. Sergeant William Myers, a gunner aboard a B-25 that flew observation missions during these attacks, later recorded in his diary, "We saw the rafts from 5,000 feet. Then the fighters went down. It was necessary, they told us. War is necessary, but watching it, I felt sick to my stomach. They were defeated men, but they were also the enemy, and orders were orders." Myers' ambivalence reflected the moral complexity of the situation, a complexity that would be debated by military historians for decades. Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 reached the area on March 5th, attempting rescue operations under cover of darkness. I-17's captain, Commander Toshite Ueno, surfaced amid the debris field and began recovering survivors. His submarine could hold perhaps 50 men beyond her normal crew, a fraction of those still alive. Ueno faced agonizing choices. He prioritized officers and specialists, pilots, engineers, communications personnel. Ordinary soldiers, the backbone of the 5th to 1st Division, were left to their fate. According to records maintained in the Japanese National Institute for Defense Studies, I-17 recovered 43 survivors over 2 nights, before American air patrols forced her to withdraw. I-20-6 saved another 37. Small rescue boats dispatched from Leh under cover of darkness retrieved approximately 150 additional survivors who had drifted close to shore. These 400-plus survivors represented less than 6% of the convoy's original complement. 94%, nearly 6,500 men, had perished in the water or gone down with their ships. On Rabaul, Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commander of the Southeast Area Fleet, confronted the magnitude of the disaster. His convoy to reinforce Leh had been annihilated. The 8th Area Army's 5th to 1st Division had effectively ceased to exist as a combat formation. Perhaps most significantly, the loss demonstrated that the Imperial Japanese Navy could no longer safely conduct daylight reinforcement convoys through the Solomon Sea and Bismarck Sea without air supremacy. American air power had become too sophisticated, too aggressive, and too effective. Kusaka ordered an immediate investigation into the skip bombing technique. Intelligence officers interviewed survivors, particularly the destroyer captains who had witnessed the attacks firsthand. Their reports painted a disturbing picture. The Americans had developed a bombing method that allowed virtually no reaction time. Traditional anti-aircraft defenses, predicated on high-altitude attack profiles, were largely ineffective against aircraft attacking from wave-top height. The 5th to 2nd interval between visual acquisition and bomb release was simply the brief for effective countermeasures. Captain Tamaichi Hara, commanding destroyer Shiger, which had been part of the convoy's escort, submitted a particularly detailed after-action report. Hara, who would survive the war and write extensively about his experiences, emphasized 3 factors that had made the American attack so devastating. First, the unprecedented low altitude eliminated the time advantage that ships normally possessed when bombers attacked from high altitude. Second, the heavy forward-firing armament suppressed defensive fire, allowing the bombers to press home their attacks with minimal interference. Third, the delayed fuse bombs ensured maximum penetration and internal damage. Hara's report recommended several countermeasures, increased emphasis on fighter combat air patrol to prevent bombers from reaching attack positions, installation of additional light anti-aircraft weapons positioned specifically to engage low-altitude targets, and development of radar-directed fire control systems that could track targets at wave-top height. But these recommendations required resources and time, neither of which the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed in abundance by March 1943. The Allied perspective on the battle was markedly different. General George Kenny submitted his report to General Douglas MacArthur on March 8, 1943. Kenny's tone was triumphant. His report, excerpts of which appear in official U.S. Army Air Force's historical volumes, emphasized that skip bombing had proven itself as a revolutionary anti-shipping technique. For the loss of only 5 aircraft and 13 aircrew, the 5th Air Force had sunk 16 ships and killed thousands of enemy troops. The kill ratio was extraordinary by any measure. MacArthur immediately recognized the strategic implications. If the Japanese could not safely reinforce their positions in New Guinea, those positions would inevitably fall. The Bismarck Sea victory essentially guaranteed that the Allied advance through New Guinea would continue unimpeded by major Japanese reinforcements. MacArthur cited the battle in communications to Washington as evidence that his Southwest Pacific campaign was progressing successfully and deserved continued resource priority. But not all Allied commanders viewed the strafing of survivors with Kenny's enthusiasm. Some Australian officers, particularly those with Royal Navy backgrounds, considered the attacks on life rafts to be violations of the laws of war. When Commander William Gehring of the RAF privately expressed concerns to his superiors that the strafing operations crossed lines that should remain uncrossed, even in warfare against a determined enemy, these concerns were noted but did not result in any policy changes. The official position, articulated by MacArthur's headquarters, was that soldiers in the water remained combatants capable of returning to battle and were therefore legitimate military targets. The ethical debate would simmer for years. Some historians would later compare the Bismarck Sea strafing to other controversial incidents of the Pacific War, arguing that it represented a degradation of combat norms. Others would emphasize the brutal nature of the Pacific theater, where surrender was rare and combat was conducted with a ferocity that exceeded even the European fronts. The question of whether the strafing was militarily necessary or morally justified remains contested. What is indisputable is the tactical revolution that skip bombing represented. Within months, every Allied Air Force in the Pacific theater was training crews in the technique. The 5th Air Force expanded its skip bombing squadrons. Modified B-25s became standard anti-shipping platforms. Japanese vessels operating in the Southwest Pacific were forced to conduct all reinforcement runs under cover of darkness or in weather so severe that air operations were impossible. Admiral Komura, who had survived the battle aboard destroyer Shikinami, was recalled to Rabaul and relieved of command. The relief was not officially characterized as punishment. Japanese military culture required more subtle approaches, but Komura understood its meaning. He had lost his convoy. The responsibility was his. He spent the remainder of the war in staff positions, never again commanding ships at sea. His military career, once promising, had been destroyed in the 50-second intervals his captains had been given to save their ships. By March 10, 1943, the last survivors still clinging to life in the Bismarck Sea had either been rescued, drowned, or been killed by exposure and predation. Sharks, drawn by blood and thrashing, had been present from the beginning. Survivors interviewed after the war spoke of the terror of those hours in the water, the knowledge that at any moment, something might strike from below. Some men simply gave up, releasing their grip on debris and allowing themselves to sink. Others maintained hope until the end, certain that rescue would come. For the families back in Japan, notification of losses came slowly and incompletely. The Army Ministry sent telegrams to next of kin stating only that soldiers were missing in action during operations in the Southwest area. Many families held on to hope for months, even years, believing their sons or husbands might be prisoners of war. In reality, the Allies had captured fewer than 20 Japanese survivors from the entire convoy, those few plucked from the water by patrol boats before Kenny's strafing orders took effect. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea entered military history as a decisive demonstration of how tactical innovation could achieve strategic effects. The 50 seconds that Japanese captains theoretically possessed to react to incoming bombers had been rendered meaningless by American ingenuity and training. The Imperial Japanese Navy's defensive doctrines, developed over decades of study and experience, had been rendered obsolete in a single battle lasting less than 3 days. The ripples from the Bismarck Sea disaster spread rapidly through the Japanese High Command. On March 15, 1943, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo convened an emergency conference to assess the strategic implications. General Hajime Sugiyama, Chief of the Army General Staff, presided over a tense meeting where staff officers presented analyses that grew bleaker with each report. The loss of the 5th to 1st Division's combat elements meant that Leh could not be adequately reinforced. Without reinforcement, Leh would fall. Without Leh, the entire defensive line in New Guinea would collapse. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, raised the question that haunted every officer present. If we cannot reinforce by sea during daylight, and we lack sufficient transport aircraft for aerial resupply. How do we sustain our forces in the southwest area? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The brutal mathematics of logistics had caught up with Japan's overextended defensive perimeter. The nation that had conquered half of Asia in 6 months now found itself unable to supply the garrisons holding those conquests. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, a staff officer specializing in air operations, presented findings from the investigation into American skip bombing techniques. His report, preserved in Japanese naval archives, contained disturbing conclusions. The technique was not some improvised battlefield adaptation. It represented a systematic development program involving modified aircraft, specialized ordnance, and extensive pilot training. The Americans had identified a weakness in Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine and had engineered a solution specifically to exploit it. Watanabe's briefing included technical details extracted from interrogations of the few captured American airmen from other operations. The B-25 modifications were extensive, nose-mounted machine gun packages, structural reinforcements to withstand low-altitude stress, and special delay-fuse bombs designed for skip bombing profiles. The pilots trained for months, practicing against mock targets at wave-top height. This was not luck or improvisation, it was methodical tactical innovation. The critical vulnerability, Watanabe explained to the assembled officers, is the reaction time. Our captains are trained to maneuver when bombers reach release altitude above them, but these aircraft release at 100 yards distance at 15 feet altitude. From the moment of visual acquisition to bomb release is approximately 50 seconds. Human reaction time, assessment of the threat, and execution of evasive maneuvers requires approximately 30 to 40 seconds minimum. The window for successful evasion is therefore 10 to 20 seconds, assuming perfect conditions and instant recognition of the threat. Admiral Nagano grasped the implication immediately. Then traditional evasive maneuvering is essentially useless against this technique. Watanabe nodded grimly. Correct, Admiral. Unless ships detect the bombers at extreme range and begin maneuvers before the attack run commences, evasion is unlikely to succeed. The only effective defense is to prevent the bombers from reaching attack position, which requires fighter superiority and effective combat air patrol. The problem was that Japan no longer possessed fighter superiority over the Southwest Pacific. The Zero fighters that had dominated the war's opening year were now matched or exceeded by newer American aircraft like the P-38 Lightning and F-4U Corsair. Japanese pilot training programs, decimated by losses and accelerated to meet demand, could not produce aviators of the quality needed to counter skilled American pilots. The spiral was descending. Fewer experienced pilots meant less effective air cover, which meant more successful Allied attacks, which killed more pilots and destroyed more aircraft. In New Guinea itself, the Japanese garrison at Leh watched the horizon with growing apprehension. General Hidemitsu Nakano, commanding the 5th to 1st Division's remnants at Leh, had been expecting reinforcements that would never arrive. His division now consisted of fewer than 4,000 effectives, short on ammunition, medicine, and food. Intelligence reports indicated American and Australian forces were massing for an offensive. Without reinforcement, they could not hold. Tokyo's response was to shift strategy. If sea convoys were too vulnerable, then submarines and high-speed destroyer runs during darkness would have to suffice. But submarines could carry only tiny fractions of the supplies needed. Destroyer runs, while faster and harder to intercept, could transport perhaps 200 troops per ship, inadequate for the scale of reinforcement required. The mathematics were unforgiving. Meanwhile, General Kenny's 5th Air Force was refining skip bombing into a precision tool. Training programs at Port Moresby and Charters Towers in Australia were producing crews specifically qualified in the technique. Maintenance personnel developed better methods for mounting the forward-firing gun packages. Armaments officers experimented with different delayed fuse timing to optimize penetration depth. What had been an innovative experiment in early March was becoming standard operational doctrine by April, according to official U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey documents compiled after the war. Skip bombing remained the primary anti-shipping technique in the Southwest Pacific. For the remainder of 1943, the technique was also adopted by units in other theaters. Navy patrol bombers began experimenting with similar approaches. The tactical revolution that had destroyed Admiral Komura's convoy was spreading throughout American air forces. For the Japanese merchant marine, the implications were catastrophic. Already suffering heavy losses to American submarines, merchant vessels now faced a new threat from the air one against which traditional defensive measures were largely ineffective. Captains of cargo ships and transports understood that if they were spotted by skip bombers during daylight, their survival depended almost entirely on luck and weather conditions. The 50-second reaction window had become infamous among Japanese mariners, who spoke of it with grim resignation. Lieutenant Commander Haruki Ito, captain of transport Osaka Maru, survived 3 separate air attacks during supply runs to New Guinea between April and July 1943. His ship bore over 40 shell and shrapnel scars. In his private diary, excerpts of which were published decades later, Ito wrote, "We see them coming low across the water, and we know we have less than a minute to turn, to pray, to hope their aim is poor. The machine guns sweep the deck like rain, then the bomb skips toward us. If it finds us, we die. There is no skill involved anymore, only fate." Japanese naval architects attempted to develop countermeasures. Proposals included increased side armor on merchant vessels to resist skip bomb penetration, automated rapid response rudder systems to reduce captain reaction time, and installation of additional light anti-aircraft weapons positioned to create defensive fire zones against low-altitude attackers. But these modifications required resources, shipyard time, and materials all in critically short supply by mid-1943. Most proposals remain on drawing boards, theoretical solutions to a very real problem. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea also influenced Japanese strategic planning in fundamental ways. Combined Fleet Headquarters concluded that large-scale amphibious operations in the Southwest Pacific were no longer feasible. The Americans had demonstrated they could interdict convoys with devastating effectiveness. Future defensive strategy would have to accept that isolated garrisons would receive minimal reinforcement and would be expected to fight to the death with whatever resources they possessed. This strategic shift had profound implications for soldiers like those who had died in the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese military's traditional emphasis on fighting spirit and acceptance of death was now being codified into operational planning. Garrisons throughout the Pacific were essentially being written off, expected to delay American advances through fanatical resistance, but not expected to survive or be relieved. The 50-second death sentence that had claimed the Bismarck Sea convoy was becoming a broader reality for thousands of Japanese servicemen stranded across the Pacific. The final accounting of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea took months to compile, as both sides struggled to verify casualties and assess strategic consequences. The U.S. 5th Air Force's official tally, published in May 1943, claimed destruction of 12 transports and for destroyers actually an overestimate, as some ships counted as sunk had actually been counted twice in separate after-action reports. The true figures, confirmed through Japanese records after the war, were 8 transports and for destroyers sunk, with several other destroyers damaged. But the human cost was beyond dispute. Of the 6,900 Japanese troops aboard the convoy, only approximately 950 survived to reach friendly territory. This represented an 86% casualty rate, one of the highest losses of any single naval action in the Pacific War. The 51st Division, which had departed Rabaul as a combat-ready force, was destroyed. The unit designation continued to exist on paper, but the division never again functioned as an effective combat formation. American losses were remarkably light by comparison. 5 aircraft were shot down during the 3 days of combat, 2 B-17s, 2 A-20s, and 1 B-25. 13 airmen were killed and 7 were captured by Japanese forces. This exchange ratio 13 American lives and 5 aircraft for 6,900 Japanese lives and 16 ships represented one of the most lopsided victories in the history of aerial warfare. The tactical effectiveness of skip bombing had exceeded even General Kenny's optimistic predictions. The families of the lost Japanese soldiers received their official notifications throughout April. In May 1943, in villages across Japan, telegrams arrived bearing the formulaic language of military loss. Died an honorable death in battle in the southwest area. No details were provided about the Bismarck Sea, the skip bombing attacks, or the hours spent struggling in oil-slick water. Military censorship ensured that the scale of the disaster remained hidden from the Japanese public. Newspapers mentioned only that enemy operations in the southwest area were successfully opposed, with suitable losses inflicted. Private Takeshi Yamada, one of the few survivors from transport Kyokusei Maru, spent 2 days clinging to a wooden hatch cover before being rescued by submarine I-17. After recovering from his ordeal, he was assigned to a garrison unit on New Britain. Years after the war, in Testi, Moni recorded by Japanese military historians. Yamada described those 50 seconds before his ship was hit. We saw the American bomber coming at us across the water. It seemed impossible. No aircraft flew that low. Our machine guns were firing, but the bomber's guns were firing back, and they had so many more guns. Then I saw the bomb skip across the water like a stone thrown by a child. It struck our hull, and I felt the impact through my boots. Then the explosion came, and everything was fire and water. The skip bombing technique continued to evolve throughout the war. By late 1943, modified B-25s in the Southwest Pacific could attack from even lower altitudes as low as 10 feet above the water with increasing accuracy. The technique spread to the Central Pacific, where Navy and Marine Corps squadrons adapted it for use against Japanese positions in the Marshall and Caroline Islands. Even after the war, skip bombing remained in military aviation manuals as a proven anti-shipping technique studied by air forces around the world. But perhaps the battle's most significant legacy was psychological. The Japanese Navy, which had opened the Pacific War with carrier strikes of unprecedented audacity, was now psychologically on the defensive. The confidence that had characterized operations in 1941 and 40 had been shattered by a succession of defeats, Midway, Guadalcanal, and now Bismarck Sea. Japanese naval officers increasingly understood that they were fighting a losing war against an enemy whose industrial capacity and tactical innovation were overwhelming Japan's initial qualitative advantages. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, reviewed reports of the Bismarck Sea battle with deep pessimism. Yamamoto had predicted before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but could not sustain a prolonged conflict against American industrial might. The Bismarck Sea disaster confirmed his fears. America was not just outproducing Japan in ships and aircraft, it was out-innovating Japan in tactics and operational methods. In April 1943, Yamamoto launched Operation I-Go, a series of airstrikes against Allied positions in the Southwest Pacific, partially intended to restore morale after the Bismarck Sea defeat. The operation achieved limited success at heavy cost. More significantly, American intelligence intercepted and decrypted Japanese communications revealing Yamamoto's inspection itinerary. On April 18, 1943, P-38 Lightning fighters ambushed Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville, killing Japan's most respected naval commander. The same American air power that had destroyed the Bismarck Sea convoy had now eliminated the combined fleet's architect. For the soldiers and sailors who had served in the Pacific, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a touchstone, a symbol of how profoundly the war had shifted. American veterans spoke of it with pride, as evidence that innovation and training could overcome numerical inferiority and achieve decisive results. Japanese survivors spoke of it with a mixture of horror and resignation, as the moment when they understood that the war was truly lost, even if surrender remained unthinkable. The 50-second warning that had proven so inadequate entered military lexicon as a cautionary tale. Post-war studies at military colleges in the United States, Britain, and elsewhere analyzed the battle as a case study in tactical innovation. The key lesson was clear. Doctrines developed for one type of threat could become fatal liabilities when adversaries developed new approaches. Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine, effective against high-altitude bombing, had created a vulnerability at low altitude. American innovators had identified that vulnerability and ruthlessly exploited it. By September 1943, lay fell to Australian and American forces. Exactly as Tokyo had feared, without the reinforcements destroyed in the Bismarck Sea, the garrison could not sustain prolonged defense. The Allied advance through New Guinea continued inexorably, island hopping toward the Philippines and ultimately toward Japan itself. Each step of that advance was made possible, in part, by the failure of Japanese reinforcement convoys that commanders refused to risk. After witnessing what had happened to Admiral Komura's ships, the final Japanese assessment of the battle, compiled by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo after the war, concluded with stark honesty. The Bismarck Sea operation represented a fundamental failure to adapt defensive tactics to emerging threats. The innovation of skip bombing by American forces created conditions wherein traditional evasive maneuvers were rendered ineffective. The 50-second interval between threat detection and weapon impact was insufficient for vessel commanders to execute successful countermeasures. This tactical defeat contributed significantly to the strategic isolation of forward garrisons and the ultimate failure of defensive operations in the southwest area. Captain Katsumi Shibuya, the destroyer commander, who had watched Horatio die beneath him in those first skip bombing attacks, survived the war and returned to Japan in 1946. He never commanded another ship. In a memoir published in 1968, Shibuya reflected on that March morning when he had spotted the B-25s coming across the water. I had 50 seconds to save my ship. 50 seconds that seemed like both an eternity and an instant. I gave the orders, but the orders came too late. Perhaps no orders would have been fast enough. We had trained for one type of war, and the Americans showed us another. Those 50 seconds taught me that in war, the side that innovates survives, and the side that remains static dies. We remained static, we died. The waters of the Bismarck Sea still hold the wrecks of those 8 transports and 4 destroyers. They rest in darkness, hundreds of feet below the surface, entombing thousands of soldiers who never reached their destination. Occasionally, divers exploring these wrecks report a sobering sight, personal effects preserved in the wreckage, say cups and family photographs carried by men who believed they would fight for their emperor in New Guinea. Instead, they found death in 50 seconds of skip bombing thunder. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as testament to a brutal truth of warfare, that courage, discipline, and tactical skill can be rendered irrelevant by innovation. The Japanese captains who fought and died in those actions were not cowards or incompetents. They were professional mariners executing doctrines that had served navies for generations. But warfare had changed, and 50 seconds was not enough time to adapt. In war, as in life, those who cannot adapt swiftly enough to changing circumstances face extinction. The Bismarck Sea taught that lesson in blood and fire. In the space between spotting an incoming bomber and feeling the skip bombs impact 50 seconds, that separated life from death, victory from defeat, survival from oblivion.